Thanks for joining us. Before I get started, I wanted to thank Michael Lorello and Jean Trantham for all their efforts in organizing these events and ensuring that they can continue at this point. This paper is part of a larger new project of mine on the role of music within Arab America and Arab American communities, especially those that relate to more locally, to Toledo, or a little semi-locally in Metro Detroit. However, the idea for this particular paper came from Michael Ibrahim, who's my co-author here, and of the National Arab Orchestra. He's a member of this community and was really excited to dig into the history and the legacy of this Archbishop Samuel David. So as an archbishop within the Antiochian Orthodox Christian Archdiocese of North America, Samuel David's religious leadership ensured a meaningful connection to immigrants from the Greater Syria region and the Arab Americans more broadly. In this paper, we explore how his voice proved significant for Arab Americans in Northwest Ohio, with attention to the conflicted and contested meanings of voice within liturgy. Liturgical performances especially reflect seemingly conflicting values while simultaneously enacting a sense of heritage, history, and nostalgia. While melodies, gestures, and maqam-based chant highlight a connection to the Middle East's musical traditions and bring together a local diasporic community, they also instigate division, bring listeners back to their childhoods, and evoke complicated tears. This project represents the earliest stage of a larger effort towards documenting and better understanding the role of music and musical activities within the local Arab American community. Religious institutions, secular organizations, and a wide range of musical tastes show the variety of ways in which a diverse community grapples with issues of identity, memory, and place. While navigating tastes and nostalgias within lived realities that are influenced by identity and politics can be a personal struggle, the process that plays out over generations gives us an opportunity to reflect on questions of immigration and inclusion that get to the core of struggles that arguably define modern American politics. In her University of Toledo master's thesis and a chapter in the book Arab Americans in Toledo, Hanindi Oweda outlines two distinct eras of Arab immigration to Northwest Ohio. She notes that Cleveland and Fort Wayne, Indiana were home to, quote, large Syrian peddling communities in the late 1800s that lacked a supply center in between them, a place where Syrians selling goods could restock as they moved from one city to the next. Toledo's access to infrastructure and rail lines convinced Michael H. Nasser to move there in 1881 from Louisiana. Upon his arrival, he opened a store and began welcoming new residents and providing advice for the primarily Christian men who were relocating within the United States after settling in other cities following their emigration from Greater Syria. Peddler work was lucrative at the time, earning nearly 3 times the typical wages as factory work. The concentration of immigrants from Syria, mostly today's Lebanon, in this career path created opportunities for entrepreneurship as more and more individuals opened stores, restaurants, or similarly permanent establishments. By the early 1900s, the community had shifted from men who hoped to return to Syria to families who were building lives in America. Like so many other immigrant groups, including many in Toledo, they settled in neighborhoods, had children, and built institutions to pass on a sense of heritage to younger generations. At the same time, they joined American civil society, sent their children to American schools, and otherwise worked to assimilate. Immigration from Syria and the Middle East to Toledo continued after World War II, but the identities of newer arrivals differed from the largely Christian established community. Muslims had been coming in small numbers since the early century and worked in the liquor industry, owning a quarter of Toledo's bars by the 1960s. As Christians climbed social and economic ladders, many sold their businesses to newcomers, transitioning the largely Christian downtown Syrian community into a Muslim one. By the 1950s, enough Muslims lived in Toledo to organize the American Muslim Society, purchase a lot, and build Ohio's first mosque. More recent immigration efforts have coincided with the rise and fall of refugees in America. As described by the founders of Us Together, a refugee resettlement organization in Toledo, large numbers were welcomed under Reagan and the administrations that followed, until the sharp decline in the resettlement quotas under the Trump administration. According to the National Immigration Forum, Ohio settled the 3rd most refugees in the country, behind Texas and Washington in fiscal year 2018. These trends speak directly to the cohesive nature of generational identity within immigrant communities. While this specific paper is about an Orthodox bishop, it also shows the role of institutionalization and generational change along lines that go beyond just age. These concerns become especially important as our project continues and widens in scope. Samuel David was born in Aiza, Lebanon in 1893 as John David Hasson. In 1908, he was ordained as a deacon in Lebanon and became known for his skill as a chanter. When he was tonsured as a monk, he was given the name Samuel. In the 1920s, he was elevated to archmandrite, a monastic title for a high-level priest that allows for promotion to bishop. And he was sent to the United States, where he was assigned to the Cathedral of St. George in Toledo. Samuel David's tenure spanned a period of political strife due in part to questions of leadership within the American Antiochian Orthodox community. In 1936, he lost an election for Archbishop of the North American Archdiocese based in New York to Anthony Bashir. His community at St. George split from New York, leading to Samuel David being excommunicated by the Church of Antioch in 1938, though he was welcomed back as Archbishop of the Antiochian Orthodox Archdiocese of Toledo and dependencies soon after in 1941. This period has colored the conversations that I had about Samuel David, not least because it led to competing Antiochian Orthodox churches within Toledo's Syrian community, the Cathedral of St. George and St. Elias, which was founded by those who wanted to remain within the New York Archdiocese. These two churches were blocks away from each other in the same Syrian neighborhood of North End, though both moved away from downtown in the 1970s as the community scattered into the Toledo suburbs. The conflict was dramatic, splitting the community. Actor and Toledo native Jamie Farr explained that, quote, "The parents were at war with each other, literally. It was the children who brought them together because we went to school together, or with one another." Similar memories of people crossing the street or turning around to walk a different route in order to avoid each other also show up in the few oral histories that we've seen and heard at this early point of research. This became national news, as even Time magazine ran an article in 1936 describing Samuel David as ambitious and conniving as he took advantage of the ambiguities of Orthodox leadership to claim power. This is a quote. "Though he could find no high Syrian prelates willing to dabble with him in muddied church waters, Archmandrite David lined up 3 sympathetic Russian bishops whose spiritual powers were, after all, as efficacious as those of any other Orthodox churchman. In St. George's Church last week, these, with the aid of 4 Orthodox priests, consecrated Samuel David. With his gilt and scarlet crown firmly on his swart head, Archbishop David thereupon waited for the Patriarch of Antioch to grant him jurisdiction to which he felt canonically entitled. Failing that, a schism was forecast among confused U.S. Syrians." This is from Time magazine in 1936. The Toledo Diocese rejoined New York under Michael Shaheen in 1975, and Samuel David is widely remembered positively for his faith, generosity, and important to our purposes here, his golden voice. Quote, "In interviews and writings by his surviving family members, this conflict was unnecessarily overblown and divided the community. The Toledo Blade, the local paper of record, even had to retract a negative story. The Antiochian Patriarch in Syria awarded David with a long list of honors, and he was remembered for his donations to the Orthodox community in his Lebanese hometown. As if to emphasize changing attitudes towards Samuel David following this period, the Toledo Blade quotes bishops from across the United States with comments like, quote, 'I am sure he is one who will follow in the footprints of the angels who glorified God,' as they came to Samuel David's funeral in 1958. Our aim is not to stress this conflict, but Father Mark of Toledo, Samuel David's great-nephew, went so far as to describe it as having been between Anthony Bashir's, quote, 'brains' and Samuel David's voice. It's too early in the project to draw much from this, but criticism leveled at Samuel David appears to have been at least partially a result of his prioritization of chanting ability in his own work and recording, and in his selection of youth to train, bring to the United States, and ordain to the diaconate. Father Mark David described his great-uncle's voice in terms of its beauty, its political significance, and its power to bring the neighborhood together. The voice was central to Samuel David's leadership from the very beginning of his time in the priesthood as a young man in Lebanon. In Father Mark's words, he was singing hymns in Arabic, and this group of maybe 3 or 4 priests said, "Who is this young man with a beautiful voice?" And it's like, "Oh, he lives in the village here. I know his parents." So they went up and they talked to him and said, "How would you like to sing and chant?" And he said, "I already do that, but I haven't heard you. Maybe I wasn't there when you sang." Then later on, they went to my great-grandparents and said, "We're going to talk to him. How would you like your son to be a priest?" And in those days, that was an honor. And so he said, "Well, yeah, let's talk to him." So they called, and at an age of 13, he went to the Belamand ceremony for priests, which is the monastery of Our Lady of Belamand. And there he developed his voice, which was beautiful to this day. As he continued, Father Mark emphasized how prioritizing the sound of the voice, and therefore focusing on the beauty of the performed liturgy, may have contributed to questions of legitimacy that split the Antiochian Orthodox community in Toledo. Basically, here's the part about the golden voice, and this is a quote, "and the one with the brains. They wanted him for the voice, especially for the voice. That's why they sent him to the seminary to be educated. Years ago, if you had a good voice, you're in like Flynn. You're going to be a priest. You know, we need a priest. Come on, you're in. Okay, let me hear you sing. All right, come on, next Saturday I'll ordain you. You have to go in order. Deacon one day, then priest the next day." People from the other side, all he does is ordain stupid priests. And so that's so ridiculous. So his council or board members said, "Sayedna, I know we need priests, but let's make sure they're educated. You were educated." So he said, "Well, you know what, guys? You're right. I'll send them to school and to get educated." And that's what he did. It's worth noting that one of Samuel David's enduring legacies was his willingness to train and educate priests. His voice, which proved influential in the beginning of his career, is clearly one of his other legacies. Beyond the Golden Voice moniker, which appears across biographical writings about Samuel David from Orthodox sources, Father Mark echoes memories of how the sound of his liturgy impacted his community. This is Father Mark again. So he became a parish priest at St. George, and people in Toledo, Ohio, came to hear him, just to hear him sing and chant. These people came, Catholics, Lutherans, and of course Orthodox. You couldn't find a place to sit down, maybe on the steps. The doors, when it was a hot day, of course, the doors would be open and the fans going, and here's his beautiful voice doing the gospel, singing the gospel and the liturgy and the hymns. It was almost like a festival in some ways. They'd sit on these steps, and they're just concrete steps, just to listen to him sing, and the board members would say, "I'm sorry guys, there's no more room. That's all right, I'll sit on the steps, I want to hear him sing." The best way I could tell you is that they came just to hear him. It was so beautiful, they never heard anything like it. Beyond liturgical singing, David has been remembered for his participation in festivities outside of the church called haflas. These appear to be similar to church festivals and included Arabic food and singing, as people would sit outside and enjoy being a part of the community, whether they are Orthodox or neighbors from around Toledo. Clifford Davis, Samuel David's nephew, remembers tables of food from a, quote, panorama of feasting in a park in the Maumee River. Once people pulled out an oud and some Middle Eastern hand drum, Samuel David would sit on the bench and sing. This is a quote, "Imagine 500 people, maybe 6, all of a sudden, like there was nothing but the wind in the trees and my uncle's voice, singing the liturgy from the church," he wrote. He continued saying, "He had that rare ability to touch people's hearts, and he touched them profoundly. The entire scene became biblical." Arab music styles appear within this liturgy in specific and technical fashion. Byzantine religious music lends its structure to early Arab systems, but the Arab maqam system has its own historical trajectory and development. Father Iman Kfuf of St. Elias Antiochian Orthodox Church in Toledo described how, despite a clear differentiation within each musical system, in contemporary practice, the maqam system can be manipulated to serve specific context, and in doing so, it can bring novel meaning to a performance. In this case, the identifiably Arab sound of the maqam carries memory and connection to a shared past and a communal present for these faithful listeners, already joining Greater Syria and Northwest Ohio and performing a ritual communion of sorts. In an interview, Father Amen shared specifics of how these adaptations occur through charts that he uses when teaching Byzantine music to his parishioners. The Byzantine system of tones provides modes that function as cohesive wholes, not unlike the maqam system. They contain a set of pitches, a scale, alongside typical gestures and development. In today's church, the maqam overlays a tone as chanters make alterations to substitute the Arab scale for the Byzantine one. I use the word scale here intentionally. The melodies and texts remain Byzantine, even when the words are translated and the intonation is Arabized. Instead of a comprehensive move from one system to another, pitch adjustments bring tone 1 to Beati by lowering the second scale degree from a slightly flattened E to an E half flat. Moreover, the fourth scale degree of G can be flattened to a G flat to move tone 1 from Beati to Saba. With the addition of Arab ornamentation, the Byzantine chant melodies approximate the sound of Arab music. In today's liturgical practice, these two performance styles can be used somewhat interchangeably. At Father Amon's St. Elias, for example, he has 3 chanters, including himself. When he leads, he uses Byzantine styles. Another chanter is an Arab musician who sings using Arab intonation and ornamentation. The third is an American convert to Orthodoxy who sings using Western tuning. One of our next goals is to explore these distinctions in practice and their meanings within the church community further. Specific liturgical pieces maintain their Arab performance practice and serve as meaningful connections to an Arab past or immigrant community at high points in the Orthodox calendar as well. One of these is El Yom Ulq al-Khashaba. Today he hung from a tree. This poem is part of the Holy Thursday service, which celebrates the Last Supper and commemorates Jesus being nailed to the cross before he dies on Good Friday and rises on Easter Sunday. The setting and liturgical performance is one that maintains Arab style, which is likely to be both a contributor to and a result of its heightened status. Moreover, performers have created recordings for sale and other purposes. One of our goals is to explore the aims and contexts behind some of these recordings, but it's notable that of the 3 examples we mentioned here, Samuel David's recording is the only one to both use instruments other than a church bell and to ignore liturgical structures in the repetition of the text. For example, unlike recordings by Fairuz or Nur al-Hedda, 2 famous Lebanese musicians whose careers included film performances and who were public faces of Lebanon's Christian community, Samuel David does not repeat the first line of his text 3 times in the recording. As we pursue this project, it'd be interesting to know if this was a technical or an aesthetic choice, or one that he or the producers deemed irrelevant because the recording was not from a religious service. In lieu of standard notation and its inflexibilities when dealing with ornaments and free rhythm, these graphs demonstrate variations in performance. Again, this is part of a larger discussion, but Samuel David's use of ornamentation and his willingness to expand phrases beyond what the other 2 artists recorded in these specific examples at least provides a sense of how the Archbishop's musical choices relate to his golden voice legacy. Here are 2 sets of examples that show these choices. The addition of structural notes and the melismatic descent are 2 common elements of Samuel David's recording. That was Fairuz, and here's Samuel David singing the same line.
الذي وشح السماء بالغيوم.
The Nur al-Hedda recording is missing a few words. But even so, you'll see in here, the Samuel David's ornamentations take far longer, as is the case with the previous example. These are all scaled, I should say, so that the timelines match, so you can see the scope of how long they're taking to chant the lines.
وابن العذراء طير
ختن البيعة سمر بالمساك وابن العذراء طينا بحربته.
The examples from Feiruz and Nur al-Hedda are not without embellishment. For example, Nur al-Hedda's recording included a dramatic change in modality that does not appear in the other two. They do, however, show Samuel David's abilities and aesthetics, even when compared to this rarefied company. While we haven't found recordings of his liturgies in Toledo churches, it's reasonable to expect that parishioners' memories of this chant would have stood out against other priests among the local community. During a phone call shortly before the last time I presented this, Michael Ibrahim described commentary from audiences attending concerts of his National Arab Orchestra in nearby Detroit. Among Arab American attendees, one of the common sentiments has been of reflection as the music invokes memory. Feedback from non-Arab attendees was more in line with the concept of tarab, as outlined by Ali Jahadrasi. The music leaves its Arab American audience feeling a form of tarab that stems from both the sounds and the nostalgia that it brings out. At the same time, less familiar listeners enjoy it through their experiences in the hall. Arabic music in the Arab American communities of Toledo and nearby Detroit means something more than tarab or musical ecstasy as described so often in the literature. It's associated with remembering. Listeners at NAO concerts or those who hear or remember Samuel David's liturgies experience tarab and use the word as such, but its meaning expands to describe a broader feeling, one that invokes beauty, memory, loss, and joy, among other things. It brings complicated tears alongside celebration and pride. The moments and spaces that we describe here include churches with wide open doors, parks and living rooms with record players. They invoke weddings, baptisms, and festivals, not to mention conflicts and reunions. Samuel David's voice was connected to the church and faith, but it was also linked to the arts, the past, and the present as a reminder of Syria and America. Thanks.
Before I begin, I would like to thank my partner, William Daniels, for inspiring and encouraging me to explore the history of Black people in early modern Germany. Early modern Germany's entanglement in the colonization and exploitation of Africa has only recently become the subject of systematic scholarly exploration. With the exception of the electorate of Brandenburg, the states of the empire were, in the words of historians Yves Rosenhaft and Felix Brahm, slavery hinterlands that did not own any colonies in Africa, but were nevertheless involved in the global slave economy. Beginning in the late 16th century, princes in German-speaking territories acquired sub-Saharan Africans, mostly boys and young men, on the international slave market through networks of agents. They were then made court servants, and their otherness was exploited as a symbol of princely magnificence. I'm showing here 3 examples of Black court servants from the late 17th and early 18th century. Parallel to this development, German court culture, art, literature, music, theology, and medicine displayed a growing interest in Blackness, characterized by both desire and contempt. In the courtly sphere, Black bodies were not only seen as desirable others, but also as curiosities that emphasized and affirmed the norm of whiteness. In the sphere of religion, blackness was frequently associated with a perceived deformity of paganism and Islam, and thus sin. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the Dukes of Württemberg, ruling over a mid-sized Lutheran territory in the southwestern part of the Holy Roman Empire, displayed a particularly strong fascination with Africa and blackness. Not only did they employ a significant number of black court servants, especially musicians, and acquired African art objects for the Ducal Kunstkammer, Africa and blackness were also frequently represented both sonically and visually in Württemberg court festivals. In my paper, I will interrogate the sacred concerto Ich bin schwarz, aber gar lieblich, I'm black but comely, by 17th century Württemberg court kapellmeister Samuel Capricornus, a setting of verses 5 and 6 from the first chapter of the Song of Songs, as a musical text that illuminates 17th century German views on blackness. This little-known piece, published in 1664, is remarkable in a variety of ways. For instance, its scoring for bass voice, 5 recorders, and continuo is unique in 17th century sacred repertoire, and it is one of the few settings of this text by a major German composer from the second half of the century. Stylistically, it contains an expressive recitative section displaying an extensive use of musical rhetoric depicting the textual image of blackness. Traditionally, discussions of musical settings of this text, especially the Latin translation Nigra sum sed formosa, have focused on their function within Catholic liturgy, particularly in Marian contexts, and have relied on allegorical interpretations of the image of blackness. Without denying the possibility of an allegorical reading, I will instead focus on how the musical representation of blackness in Capricornus' concerto communicates actual stereotyping images of blackness common in contemporary 17th century discourses and culture. My understanding of blackness in an early modern European context draws on the work of historians and literary historians, such as Kim Hall, Kate Lowe, and Anu Korhonen. With them, I view blackness as a social construction of difference and exclusion that emerged within the context of European colonialism parallel to the construction of whiteness, and ultimately served the self-affirmation of European colonizers and also as a justification of slavery. Even though, as Hall has noted, the usage of the term black runs the risk of homogenizing an ethnically and culturally diverse group of people, it can be used productively, quote, as a term that foregrounds the role of color in organizing relations of power. In my paper, I will first briefly address the complex exegetical history of the two verses in question, and will then focus on an analysis of the musical rhetoric of Capricornus' concerto, as I hope to demonstrate the seemingly obscure piece can serve as a focal point to understand intersections between musical representation, early modern imaginings of blackness, and the history of race formation, especially in the context of religion. The inclusion of the Song of Songs, a collection of poems celebrating sensual love, in the canonical books of scripture in both Jewish and Christian traditions was made possible through the trick of allegorical reading. In Christianity, the narrative of the poems represents Christ's love for the Church. In the Middle Ages and later, the beloved of the song was also identified as the Virgin Mary, which led to the admission of texts from the song as part of the Marian liturgy. It is important to note how the meanings of the words black and beautiful have shifted in the long interpretation and translation history of these poems. In its original context, the Hebrew word for black, shechorah, does not have any racial connotations, but simply refers to the fact that the young woman's skin is dark because of her exposure to the sun in the vineyard. Her dark appearance thus does not conform to urban standards of beauty represented by the daughters of Jerusalem. Furthermore, the Hebrew prefix "the," linking black and beautiful, v'nava, does not necessarily carry the adversarial meaning found in Jerome's Latin Vulgata translation, Nigra sum sed formosa, and also in later translations into other languages, such as Luther's German translation, schwarz aber gar lieblich. Interestingly, the Greek Septuagint that predates the Vulgata translates "the" as kai, black and beautiful. Jerome's translation choice had fatal consequences, especially after the words black and beautiful became racialized in an early modern European context, and as historian Kate Lowe has pointed out, quote, "The adversarial nature of the phrase was adopted as a linguistic and cultural formation, which effectively enshrined an acceptance of low expectations in relation to the attributes and capabilities of sub-Saharan Africans." End of quote. Lowe cites many examples from historical documents, travel descriptions, literary texts such as poetry to demonstrate this phrase's culturally and socially formative character. Its impact on musical composition, not mentioned in Lowe's list, is an area of study that warrants further exploration. For 16th and 17th century music, the analysis of musical rhetoric appears to be a particularly productive approach to show what kind of musical ideas and structures were associated with the words black and comely. A comprehensive list of musical compositions on these verses still needs to be assembled, and therefore my following discussion is only meant to be preliminary. It is worth pointing out, however, that, as Jeffrey Kurtzman has noted, quote, compositions on Nigra Sum became fairly popular in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, especially after the publication of Palestrina's 1583-84 motet collection, which he devoted exclusively to settings from the Song of Songs. End of quote. In this group of compositions, Monteverdi's setting from his 1610 Vespers stands out because of its pronounced recitative style and its ample use of musical rhetoric, both of which invite comparison to Capricornus' concerto. Early 17th century composers in Lutheran Germany, such as Leonhard Lechner, Michael Pretorius, and Melchior Frank, showed a similar interest in setting this text at the beginning of the century. Musical rhetoric about blackness is prevalent in both Italian and German settings. The setting of Nigra simply in contrast to the more florid, elaborate passages on Formosa, the use of low vocal tessitura to set the adjective Nigra in contrast to higher settings of Formosa, the association of blackness with a minor key, the use of syncopation leading to dissonances and confusion of meter. I'm going to show in my following analysis how Capricornus carries this musical rhetoric even further and moves, also through his textual choice and instrumentation, the image of blackness into the center of his concerto. It is no exaggeration to consider Samuel Capricornus, Kapellmeister at the Württemberg court from 1657 until his premature death at age 36 in 1665, as one of the most original, influential, productive, and learned composers of his generation. His music was strongly influenced by Heinrich Schütz, as well as by composers from the Habsburg realm and Italy, especially Giacomo Carissimi. It is worth noting that Capricornus was not only a prolific composer of sacred, but also of secular music, for instance, of an opera, the music of which sadly appears to be lost. His sacred concerto Ich bin schwarz was published in his Dritter Teil Geistliche Harmonien of 1664, a collection of 18 sacred concerti for mostly three voices, various combinations of 1 to 6 string, wind, and brass instruments, and basso continuo. Judging by the collection's very neutral, generic dedication letter, the music did not have an explicit liturgical purpose. Perhaps it had a similar function of contemporary German collections of sacred concertos titled Kirchen- und Tafelmusik, such as Andreas Hammerschmidt's collection for similar forces published in 1662, i.e. concertos that could be performed in church and in secular contexts. Since there is, as far as I'm aware, currently no commercially available recording, I recorded this piece last year with a group of colleagues and students from BGSU, featuring as vocal soloist my colleague Dr. Ryan Ibrahim. The concerto begins with a dignified sonata for 5 recorders and continuo in duple meter, followed by a recitative involving the solo bass voice on the words Ich bin schwarz, aber gar lieblich, also in duple meter. The sonata is repeated after the recitative and thus functions as its structural frame. Then, for just 5 measures, the bass and recorders join forces to declaim the words Ihr Töchter Jerusalem. Motivically and harmonically, the short section recalls the first 2 measures of the sonata, illustrating Capricornus' interest in motivically integrating instrumental and vocal sections. The last section on the word of verse 6 is in triple meter and has the most weight in the piece. In this section, the bass on the one and the recorders on the other engage in the lively dialogue. Capricornus' concerto not only stands out because of its unique instrumentation and scoring, which I will discuss later, but also because of its textual choice, verses 5 and 6 of the first chapter of the Song of Songs, verses whose theme has frequently been interpreted as blackness. While other 17th century settings such as Monteverdi's Nigra Sum do not musically dwell on that theme and include other verses from the Song of Songs and even non-biblical material, Capricornus emphasizes it by repeating the word schwarz no less than 22 times. Aside from these conspicuous textual repetitions, Capricornus' concerto is also remarkable for its intense use of musical rhetorical figures to represent the adversarial character of the black but beautiful formulation, as well as the etiological explanation of blackness in verse 6. In my brief analysis, I'm following the terminology of musical rhetorical figures as discussed by Dietrich Bartel and George Bülow. The recitative section begins with a gesture of exclamation, exclamatio, by the means of a melodic leap upper fourth, emphatically stating the black identity of the speaker. Yet, at the same time, this emphatic proclamation is weakened by the rather unusual syncopated offbeat first utterance of the Ich statement, syncopatio, which is repeated again offbeat after an eighth note rest, abruptio, repetitio. In the relatively short recitative section of 25 measures, this distinctive motivic unit combining these four different musical rhetorical devices is stated no less than 10 times, further adding to its emphatic, urgent character. The musical identity and meaning of this phrase is further shaped by the contrast with the style of the preceding recorded sonata and the following musical representation of the word lieblich. Both the melody and largely also the bass line of the mostly homophonic sonata and the melodic line used for Aber gar lieblich move in a diatonic and rhythmically smooth fashion and with clear tonal direction. Through this contrast, further emphasized by the syncopated note for Aber, the musical representation of Ich bin schwarz itself appears not only rhythmically disjunct, but also harmonically unstable, owing to the tonal ambiguity and instability created by the leaping perfect fourths, an instability that appears to undermine the very capability of the speaker to make that utterance. When the second statement of Ich bin schwarz follows in measure 16, the sudden shift from C major to E major, a mutatio toni, adds an element of harmonic harshness. Taking these different rhetorical elements together, it appears that Capricornus' compositional choices seek to represent blackness as something that is raw, unrefined, and disorderly. Notably, the word aber, previously only emphasized through syncopations, moves into the foreground in the final measures of the recitative section by getting two elaborate 16th-note melismas. Lieblich, on the other hand, is represented through half steps, the last of which in measure 39, a patopoeia, leads to an expressive clash with the F-sharp and the underlying continuo chord. I'm now going to play the whole recitative.
Ich bin schwarz, ich bin schwarz, aber gar lieblich, aber gar lieblich. Ich bin schwarz, ich bin schwarz, ich bin schwarz, aber gar lieblich, aber gar lieblich. Ich bin schwarz, ich bin schwarz, ich bin schwarz, aber gar lieblich, aber gar lieblich. Aber gar lieblich, gar lieblich, aber gar lieblich, gar lieblich.
The four musical rhetorical devices introduced in the beginning of the recitative in conjunction with the word schwarz, exclamatio, syncopatio, abruptio, and repetitio are all combined in the final section in triple meter to express blackness. The combination of these devices is further intensified by the insertion of another rest, so that the word schwarz is repeated 3 times in a row, over a descending bass line extending over the range of a fourth. This device is echoed instrumentally by the recorders in the following measures.
Sehet mich nicht an, dass ich so schwarz, schwarz, schwarz bin. Sehet mich nicht an, dass ich so schwarz, schwarz, schwarz bin. Sehet mich nicht an, dass ich so schwarz, schwarz, schwarz bin.
The unique instrumentation and scoring also has a rhetorical character, juxtaposing dark and bright tone colors in a striking way. One may safely assume that Capricornus chose the bass voice to represent the image of blackness, a choice that resembles Monteverdi's scoring of Nigra Sum for tenor voice and also recalls vocal ensemble settings by Lechner and Praetorius. With this in mind, the composer apparently chose to employ the recorders, instruments that were otherwise only rarely used in early to mid-17th century German sacred music, for the sake of contrast, to emphasize the dark tone color of the bass voice and thus, on the textual level, the image of blackness. It is important to note in this context that Capricornus notates the recorder parts in the Chiavetes system. As Peter van Heegen has pointed out, this circumstance, as well as the overall ranges of the instruments, suggest that the composer intended these parts for 2 sopranos in C, 1 alto in F, and 2 tenors in C. This is an ensemble that, as my own performance experience has shown, produces a very bright sound with ample overtones. But what again is the symbolism of this instrumentation aside from its function to provide sonic contrast? If the bass voice indeed represents the image of blackness, then I would like to argue the recorders signify the textual image of lieblich, comely, and by extension the larger racial concept of whiteness. A semantic link also suggested on the musical level when one considers the aforementioned similarity between the opening of the sonata and the statement of lieblich in measure 37-38. This interpretation is admittedly speculative, but it can be further supported by parallels in contemporary religious discourses on blackness, in which the alleged, quote, sinful, deformed black body and the whiteness of Christian faith are juxtaposed. This particular juxtaposition abounds, for instance, in this published sermon, Morentauf, held on the occasion of the baptism of Christian Real, a 14-year-old boy who had been abducted from West Africa, sold into slavery, and eventually brought to Germany in 1657. It is possible that Capricornus, who had studied theology in his youth, knew this publication. Very much in the vein of the black but beautiful formulation, one of the dedicatory poems states that, quote, blackness does not harm, provided a white faith looks through the black skin. Analogies to this adversarial racial logic can also be found in numerous paintings from the 17th and the 18th centuries, in which a man or a woman of princely rank is accompanied by a black servant. In these paintings, blackness is used to accentuate the whiteness of nobility as the normative standard of beauty. To add another, again speculative, yet compelling nuance of meaning, it seems significant that the concerto was composed during a time when at least 2 black Africans worked at the Württemberg court as servants. Capricornus would have interacted with them on a daily basis. One of them, the aforementioned Christian Real, was still enslaved when he was trafficked to Stuttgart in the very same year, 1657, when Capricornus was appointed Kapellmeister. Was there an occasion, perhaps the arrival of the young African at court, where he was supposed to be, in the words of a contemporary poem, refined and ennobled, that would have provided Capricornus with a reason to compose this piece? Even though further archival research is needed to understand the actual Sitz im Leben of the concerto, I hope to have demonstrated through both analysis and cultural contextualization how it resonates with the deeply ambiguous views on blackness prevalent in 17th century Germany and how it more generally reflects the culturally and socially defining character of the formulation, "I am black but beautiful." Thank you.